A sealed police envelope with a human hair and a lab stamp sits on my kitchen table this morning. Sealed police envelope holds a typed note and a scuffed barcode. The detective leaves a voicemail. He says my DNA matches an unidentified female. Yellowing census ledger lies open beside the envelope. My grandmother's handwriting fills the page. My grandmother is dead. Vial inside a courier kit sits on my lap when I call the number. A woman answers. We need a family reference sample, she says. I ask, you mean mine? She says, yes. It's urgent. Folded pedigree chart sits under the ledger. I pull old photos out of a box. My cousin shrugs. Grandpa said he left, he says. Sealed police envelope flips open when I tug the flap. The note reads, unidentified female, approximate age 30-40, found 1923. I say, 1923? My cousin goes quiet. Folded pedigree chart shows a crossed-out name with a red pin. I call the detective back. He says, we used a genealogical match to narrow a branch. I ask, so my family is connected? He says, there's a statistical likelihood. We need more samples. Vial inside a courier kit sits on my counter the next day. A neighbor watches as I sign the consent form. He says, be careful, I say. Careful about what? He shrugs and walks away. Yellowing census ledger sits open to ports of entry. My finger rubs at an inked year and smears it. I ask my mother, did you know this name? The house stays quiet. Sealed police warrant folder arrives at my door later that week. Reporters cluster outside. A woman thrusts a microphone. Are you related? She asks. I say, yes. I close the door. Folded pedigree chart gets emailed to a stranger who matched on a genealogy site. He replies, I have one record that mentions a transfer. Then he stops answering. I write down the time he last replied. Vial inside a courier kit sits on the counter for 3 days. The detective leaves another voicemail. He sounds tired. We can get a court order if you refuse, he says. I say nothing. Yellowing census ledger shows a passenger list with a smudge on one line. I take a photo and zoom until the letters blur. A faint A and maybe an L appear. I send the photo to a local archivist. Folded pedigree chart pins faces to the fridge. Red pins, map questions. My aunt calls and says, Grandma mentioned a well once. They left a name there. I say, a well, she says. Yes. Don't make a joke, then goes quiet. Sealed police warrant folder posts online when the local paper scans it. Neighbors whisper on porches. My boss asks if I can work from home. I say, yes. Vial inside a courier kit gets placed into a lab bag at the station. A court clerk calls 3 days later. There's a hearing, she says. The family has to sign off on access to public records, I say. I will go. Yellowing census ledger folds into my bag the morning of the hearing. I meet the detective at the courthouse steps. He hands me a printed chain of custody. He says, we need you to identify any family names. I say, I can try. Folded pedigree chart sits on the defense table during the hearing. The room smells like coffee and paper. The prosecutor points to the ledger and says, this document shows family presence in 923. The judge asks me to step forward. My mouth goes dry. Vial inside a courier kit comes up in testimony. A forensic genealogist says, the match is 2 to 3 degrees removed. It is not conclusive. I ask, so it could be wrong. She says, statistically, no, but we need confirmatory records. Sealed police warrant folder leaks to a local blogger that afternoon. The blogger posts a scanned death record. Comments fill with suspicion. I put my phone face down. Folded pedigree chart gets a lead when the archivist calls back. She says, there's a railway ledger entry from 1923 listing a transfer to a workhouse and one name. I ask, what name? She says, Alice Spence. Yellowing census ledger compares to the railway ledger. The dates match. The archivist emails a low-resolution scan. I print it and bring it to my lawyer. Vial inside a courier kit sits in evidence while the lab sends a second report. The report lists haplogroups and markers. My lawyer reads it and says, combined with the ledger, this is significant. Folded pedigree chart finds an ally when a retired lab technician emails me. He says, I worked on dough kits. I saw sloppy record keeping. He offers to meet. I say, when? He says, tonight. Bring the ledger scans. Yellowing census ledger sits under a yellow lamp in the archive reading room that night. The retired tech taps the printed railway ledger with a pen. This ledger was misfiled, he says. He points to a pencil note that reads, Spence. I ask, why does that matter? He says, because that pencil note can be authenticated. Vial inside a courier kit sits forgotten on a shelf while we work the registers. The retired tech slides an index card across the table. The handwriting matches the ledger pencil, he says. This card belonged to the clerk who logged transfers. Folded pedigree chart becomes evidence when we file a quiet request with the archive. The archive replies with an accession sheet and a return receipt. The sheet shows movement in 1972 and again in 1998. The return signature is unfamiliar. Sealed police warrant folder resurfaces at a small press conference. I stand with a retired tech and my lawyer. I hold up the photocopy of the ledger with a pencil note. I say, "This is not just DNA matches. This is a recorded name," he says. "She had a name. Alice Spence." Yellowing census ledger sits in the clerk's hands at a late administrative hearing. The clerk reads the accession sheet aloud. "Ledger misfiled. Pencil note observed 1947, she says. She looks at me. "We can authenticate the note through our chain," she adds. Folded pedigree chart fits into a legal box. Our lawyer files a motion to restore the name to public records. The judge reads the photocopy and the retired tech's affidavit. He sets a ruling date. Vial inside a courier kit is no longer the only object that matters. The ledger and photocopy become proof of a name. The prosecutor agrees to limited disclosure to confirm identity. The court allows access to certain records. Sealed police envelope stays closed on an agency desk when an internal memo arrives. The memo recommends adding the ledger note to the DO file. Someone initials it. I see the initials when I get a copy. Folded pedigree chart gets a small victory in the ruling. The judge orders the DO file updated to include Alice Spence as a possible identification. He limits further release until next of kin notification. Cameras are not allowed. Yellowing census ledger returns to my grandmother's attic a month later. I nail a small metal nameplate to the rim of the old well near the property line. A handful of neighbors watch. I hammer the plate with steady hands. Vial inside a courier kit finally closes a loop when the lab posts a confirmation. The DNA is not a courtroom verdict alone, but paired with the ledger it names a line. The lab report and our chain of custody match. Folded pedigree chart sits quiet on my fridge. The red pins remain. One pin now has a label. My cousin calls. He says, "People are talking less now," I say. "Good." He laughs softly. "You did it," he says. Sealed police envelope stays folded into a court file drawer, now stamped, updated. The retired tech sends a final note. He says, "You gave someone back a name." I say, "We did what we could." Yellowing census ledger rests on my table. The nameplate on the well sits under dusk. Names matter. Give names back. A sealed police envelope with my name says my family matches a century-old homicide victim. Ledger sits open on a chair in my grandmother's attic. She hums in the next room and folds a towel. I started uploading family DNA 2 years ago. Vial sits in a courier kit when the detective comes to my door. He passes it through the screen and taps the barcode. He says, "We need cheek swabs from you and your cousins." I say, "Why me?" He says, "Your line came up in the match." Chart sits on my laptop the next morning. Red pins mark branches. One branch ends with a name scratched out. I call my cousin Mark. He answers on the second ring. He says, "We don't talk about that side," I say. "You barely know them," he says. "We didn't keep papers." File sits in the public records box at the county hall. The clerk studies the stamp that reads unknown. She says, "We sealed it for the investigation. You must file a request." My pen shakes under the fluorescent lights. Folder sits under a reading lamp at the county archives at midnight. The pages are brittle, and I find a photograph stuck to a page corner. A woman leans against a well. No name. I take photos with my phone. My hands move fast. Receipt sits in an old trunk I open with a key from my grandmother. It is a train ticket stub dated 1923. The port name matches the photograph location. I text Mark a photo, he says. "That could be anyone." I say, "But it is our port," he says. "We need proof." Envelope sits in my mailbox 2 days later with a detective's voicemail transcription. The note says, "Possible DNA link to Dokit. Please come." The detective plans a conference call with a forensic genealogist. I replay the call at my kitchen table. The genealogist's voice is calm through the static. Vial sits under a lamp when I mail my cheek swab. The courier taps the barcode into a tablet. I watch progress updates for 3 weeks. Each status change tightens my stomach. The DNA site flags a distant cousin match the next morning. The match has a small tree online. Folder sits on the county historian's desk when I bring the archived photograph. He taps a paper with a red stamp that reads unknown. He says, "This ledger entry was added after the body came in. No ID was found." He shows a handwritten note that says rail transfer noted. I take another photo. Chart sits on my kitchen counter and begins to make sense. I cross-reference names and find a middle name that matches my grandmother's. I call my grandmother and put the ledger on speaker. She holds the phone for a long time and stays quiet. Then she says, "They called her something else." I say, "What did they call her?" She says, "Different papers, different port, they sent her away." Form sits in an email attachment the police send. The court, Authorized consent lets them compare our swabs to a forensic kit labeled Doe, a 1923. I read the lines and initial the PDF. It feels like permission and a command. I hit send. Folder sits on the detective's desk the day the genealogy lab emails a hit confirmation. The subject reads close family match. He calls me into a conference room. The genealogist points at overlapping segments on the screen. He says, this increases the probability significantly. I say, how certain are you? He says, we need more records to seal it. Binder sits in my hands as I drive to the parish office. Rain hits the windshield. The record keeper flips baptism pages and finds a ledger entry with 2 names under one line. He says, one entry says transported, one says missing. He points to a column labeled rail transfer. I snap a photo. Photograph sits pinned to my fridge by evening. I stare at the woman's face. Her eyes are small and direct. I press my thumb against the glass. I do not say her name aloud yet. Warrant sits on the courthouse steps later that week with a press stamp. Someone leaks the possible link, reporters call my office, and a camera appears across from my building. The leak drags the case into public view. I did not want this. Badge sits on the prosecutor's desk when they call for a meeting. The Da leans back and taps his pen. He says, we need ironclad documentary proof before filing anything. I slide the ledger photocopy across the table. He studies my copy. He says, this could be forged. I say, it is an official photocopy with the archivist stamp. He says, we need an original entry certified. Ledger sits in a sealed box the archivist refuses to release without a subpoena. I leave with an unsigned request form. A retired lab technician stands in the doorway and holds his hat. He says, they closed cases like that all the time. I say, who closed it? He says, clerks and certain detectives. Affidavit sits on my kitchen table when the retired tech emails me later. He remembers handling the Doe kit decades ago as a junior tech. He writes about a railway manifest he once copied by hand. He says the manifest names a family and a destination. He offers to go with me to the archive. Photocopy sits under my phone screen in the reading room the next day. The retired tech leans close to the ledger with a magnifying glass. He traces a pencil line and points with a small tremor. He says, see this ink? Someone added it later in a different hand. I say, who had access? He says, certain clerks and one detective who handled transport cases. Certificate sits in my bag when the DA files for release. The DA forwards a subpoena for the original ledger entry. Cameras zoom. I keep my head down on the courthouse steps. A clerk hands me a copy of the filing, and I fold it into my pocket. Envelope sits in evidence when the police pull the original ledger. The ledger has a torn corner and a faint thumbprint in the margin. The margin note says, rail transfer noted. The archivist signs off. The DADA files it. The judge sets a hearing before a packed gallery. Warrant sits on the judge's bench on the hearing morning. The courtroom is tight and echoing. The judge reads for 5 minutes, then asks the detective to explain chain of custody. The detective reads from a logbook and chokes on a name. He says, I cannot account for this entry between 1923 and 1930. I say nothing and breathe shallow. Logbook sits open on the prosecutor's table when the retired lab tech testifies. He speaks slowly and points to the ledger. He says, I kept a copy of the manifest. It lists a transfer to the port where the photograph was taken. He presents a photocopy of his old note. He says, this shows movement from station to ship. I say, does that confirm identity? He says, it links the ledger to the photograph and the transfer. Folder sits beside the judge's gavel when the defense pushes back. The defense argues the evidence chain is weak and demands more corroboration. My grandmother sits in the third row with a knitted shawl and stares at her knees. Photograph sits on the evidence table as the prosecutor lays out the timeline. He lines up the ledger entry, the train ticket, the manifest photocopy, and the DNA match chart. Each item connects to the next. The judge turns the photograph over in his hand. Report sits on the clerk's desk when a neighbor testifies. The neighbor remembers a woman who left town and never came back. She says it in one sentence, then covers her mouth. He says, I recall a family leaving for a port. I say nothing. Entry sits in front of the judge when he leans forward. He reads the original ink in the margin note. He looks at me for the first time in public and keeps it procedural. He says, this record changes the chain. It suggests an unrecorded transfer. I say, then what now? Entry sits on a table in the archive at night when the retired tech and I return after the hearing. We request related transport paperwork. He goes to a back room and returns with a thin bundle. He pulls out a page without asking. He says, I kept a copy when I retired. I say, why now? He says, because it needed someone to follow it. Manifest sits in his hand and flips the power in the case. He gives the manifest to the DA's office. The DA compares it to the ledger and the photograph. The defense must now answer why a transfer was hidden. The prosecutor files an amendment. The judge orders a formal identification. File sits on the evidence shelf when the lab runs the final check. The lab emails a secure link with the subject line identified, Alice Spence. My fingers are steady when I open it. The file shows the DNA match and the chain of documentary evidence. The name sits next to the old stamped label, unknown. Nameplate sits at the edge of the well when we place it at dusk. It reads Alice Spence. The crowd is small and quiet. My grandmother ties a ribbon and sets it on the rim. The retired tech folds his hands at the back. Photographer asks me one question. She says, "How does it feel?" I say, "It feels like a name coming home." Nameplate clicks as we nail it down. The sound is small and exact. My grandmother touches the metal and closes her eyes for a long, steady count. Return names. Keep records honest. Envelope from the police. Says my family matches a century-old unidentified body in our county morgue. Paper knife slices the seal. A stamped letter drops onto my table. Ledger lies open in the attic under a single lamp. My grandmother sits across and folds her hands. She reads a name and goes quiet. I write it down. Vial sits in the courier kit the detective mailed. A barcode peels at the corner. The genealogist speaks fast on my phone. "We have a broad match," she says. "We need closer relatives," I say. "Tell me what you need." Receipt sits folded in my pocket the next morning. The detective left a voicemail, he says. "This could name her." I say, "Do it." Laptop rests on my basement bench. An unknown match sends one sentence and a photo. The image shows a 1922 transfer note and a surname tied to my tree. I zoom in. Chart is a printed pedigree with red pins. 2 pins overlap in the same decade. The overlap points to a county with an unknown case file. A cousin in that county texts, "Meet me Tuesday." Box arrives at the archive at noon. The attendant slides it across the table. I sign a release and open it. A folder stamped unknown in red sits inside. I put on gloves. Card is a photocopy of a certified death record tucked in the folder. The name line sits blank. Someone penciled, possibly Spence. I photograph it and send the image to the detective. He calls back. Envelope from the police shows a franked return and a lab code. I match the code to the vial. I drive to the forensic office. A tech shows me a log with timestamps. It reads, "Doe kit received, 1923 samples typed, match flagged." The log ties to the folder I hold. Notebook sits in my bag with a number for a retired lab technician. He answers on the second ring. He says, "I used to catalog those transfers." He asks, "Do you have the ledger entry?" I read the transfer line aloud. He goes quiet. He says, "Bring it." I'll check the originals. Ledger rests on a metal shelf at the old state depot. The retired tech wears an old press badge. He pulls a bound book with a frayed spine. A single unsigned entry reads, "Transfer to Central Morgue Alice Spence, 1923. He taps the line. He says, "This is the one they missed." I say, "So it is her." Folder sits on the courthouse bench when the leak hits the press. Cameras line the courthouse steps. A clerk checks my name and makes me sign. The prosecutor looks at the folder and says, "You need counsel." I say, "I can't wait." Slip is a photocopy of a requisition the court clerk used to sign. She steps forward and hands it to me. "I signed this," she says. "It should never have been archived as unknown." Her hands tremble a little. Clipboard rests on the defense table when the judge returns. The retired tech testifies in a plain voice. He says, "I catalog transfers in that era. Records are inconsistent." The prosecutor objects. The judge allows the testimony. Envelope in my lawyer's hand contains a dry motion. The motion asks for a custodial reclassification. It names a missing signature and a misfiled box. The judge reads and signs. Archive sits under new light a week later. The archivist emails scans of a railway transfer log and a hospital receipt. The receipt lists an admission on the same date. The railway log shows transfer to coroner with the case number from the police log. I print the scans. Phone buzzes with a detective and a photo. He shows a thin brass plate with tiny letters. Someone has added Alice Spence above the rust. He says, "We put a name." Box arrives at my door days later with an official packet. Inside sits a certified death record photocopy. The page has a judge's stamp and a clerk's signature. The chain of custody shows the name added by court order. My hands shake a little when I read it. Well sits at the edge of town on the last day of my search. 10 of us gather at the cracked rim. The detective and the retired tech stand near me. The archivist brings a printed ledger page. I nail the brass nameplate to the stone rim. My hammer is light. I drive 2 nails and press the plate flat. Plaque reads Alice Spence. Someone in the crowd says, "Thank you," I say. She had a name. Photo of the ledger goes into the archive with an annotation. The clerk files an addendum linking the unknown case to my family line. The state updates its index. The detective closes the duo file with a new tag and lists our family contact. The retired tech texts, "Glad we fixed it." Envelope lands in my inbox later from the prosecutor. It admits administrative errors. The note reads, "Administrative oversight. Apologies. I file it with the ledger and the nurse's intake log that recorded an unnamed patient. I keep a folder labeled name. Ledger sits under the lamp on my shelf now. I add a sticky tab with the archive box number and the judge's order date. I leave one corner of the plaque rough. It should look like it belongs, not like a trophy. Window opens that evening. I call my grandmother. She is silent for a long beat and then says, I remembered her. I say, we put her name back. She replies, good. I say, good. Plate in the archive is scanned into a public database the county index updates. The unknown tag becomes Alice Spence, identified by court order. The retired tech texts, name restored. I walk home. Bench at the park near the well is where I sit the week after. Kids race past the plaque. I put my hand on the cool metal where my hammer hit. I close the ledger and tuck it in my bag. Nameplate nailed. Ledger closed. Case number updated. Small justice done. Always check the records.